And now I would like to pass the floor to our first expert panel on countering terrorism in the MENA region, moderated by our very own Vanessa Hungeling. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gregor. Good morning and a warm welcome to everyone also from my side. My name is Vanessa Hungeling, and as Gregor Jecke just mentioned, I work for the Syria-Iraq office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung here in Beirut. And today I have the honor of being your moderator for the first panel, which will cover 3 inputs on the overall topic of countering terrorism in the MENA region, interests and policies. As you can see in the program, we were initially planning on having two experts on input number 3. However, unfortunately, our fourth panelist can't be here with us today, so Hanna Notte will give us her perspective on the Russian counterterrorism policies, and then Dr. Stephen Tankel was so kind to offer to say some words about the American perspective on counterterrorism policies in the region. So yeah, let's not lose any time and start with the first input of Mr. Matthew Bamber of the Graduate Institute, Geneva.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to say many thanks to the Stiftung, Maison du Futur, and the Wilfrid Martin Center for inviting me to speak today. So I've been asked to discuss the adaptation of the tools and policies of counterterrorism globally, and both in relation to Iraq and Syria. There are 3 issues related to this topic that I'll discuss today. Firstly, the initial explosion and consequent path dependence of counterterrorism legislation. Secondly, the reactive and inflexible nature of counterterrorism policies, before finally discussing the battle between hard and soft counterterrorism approaches in Iraq. So with regards to counterterrorism legal frameworks, there has been an explosion of specific counterterrorism legislation in the intervening years since 9/11 at both a state and multilateral level. Prior to 9/11, only 31 states had some form of dedicated CT law, whereas by 2014, this had more than tripled, with 109 states enacting some type of counterterrorism legislation. A multitude of multilateral organizations have also passed treaties, resolutions, and created new organizations for the sole purpose of combating terrorism. The most comprehensive of these multilateral tools is the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. The overwhelming majority of this new CT legislation has come from Western states, who continue to dominate the counterterrorism legislation landscape. Ideas and definitions regarding counterterrorism have often been formed in Western governments and then adapted by other states later on. An example of this is the UK definition of terrorism, which was almost wholesalely adopted by former Commonwealth countries over the 2000s. The explosion of counterterrorism legislation at both a state and multilateral level has not necessarily resulted in greater understanding of or collaboration around some of the key issues in counterterrorism, such as actually defining what terrorism is and ensuring that counterterrorism legislation also protects individuals and society's human rights. Instead, the grey areas that the overlapping legislation creates in the CT legal architecture has resulted in some laws and policies that are deliberately opaque and can be used for nefarious purposes. The concept of path dependence is useful when looking at the evolution of counterterrorism legislation over the past 2 decades. This path dependence is the expectation that states are more likely to adopt CT laws and policies if they already have a history of doing so. Instead of creating new legislation in response to the changing nature of terrorism threats, the states are more likely to iteratively update its existing legislation. The most recent counterterrorism laws are therefore often a mere update of legislation that is around 2 decades old. This is important as the repeated updating of old laws compounds the issues around transparency and often inhibits states from examining whether its legislation is both proportionate to and effective against the current terrorism landscape. Moving on to the reactive nature of counterterrorism laws and policies, counterterrorism legislation is predominantly reactive, and there is often a feedback loop between the actions of terrorist groups and the creation of new state legislation. States often come under severe pressure to react to terrorist attacks with new laws, even if the laws are an overreaction or actually unlikely to help prevent or stop future attacks. The need to be seen to be doing something has often driven states to return to and update their CT policies regardless of whether they are fit for purpose. Of course, sometimes it is only natural that CT legislation happens after a terrorist attack. It can mean that a novel tactic, or a new front by a terrorist group requires updating existing legislation to help combat and prevent these innovations. This can be seen in the use of social media by terrorist groups. For example, ISIS's innovative use of social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook to propagate its message and to recruit members naturally resulted in a mass of new laws, tools, and public-private partnerships to combat this activity. The fact that CT policies, tools, and legislations are primarily reactive is an issue due to the exceptional adaptable nature of terrorist groups. Terrorist groups are often able to shift between its tools, operational strategies, and targets, often using and exploiting advances in technology that states have often not had a chance to legislate on full stop, and let alone to legislate to incorporate these new technologies in its counter-terrorism laws. The case of ISIS in Iraq and Syria is a pertinent example of the limits of the reactive nature of many CT policies and instruments. ISIS's modus operandi, when Operation Inherent Resolve was founded, was to conquer and hold and govern territory in Iraq and Syria. The counterterrorism operation of Inherent Resolve was very successful, in partnership with non-state groups and other state actors, in reducing ISIS's territorial reach. However, since the fall of its territory, ISIS has returned to the traditional insurgency tactics that it was using when it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Islamic State in Iraq. As a result, many of the principles behind Operation Inherent Resolve are no longer fit for purpose. And in order to combat the new threat that ISIS poses, it will have to have a significant change in the way that it operates. ISIS's ability to be flexible and change its modus operandi means that purely reactive counterterrorism operations are unlikely to be successful in eradicating the group. And this is where the asymmetric power relationship between states and terrorist groups might work in the favor of terrorist groups themselves, as they can often adapt to and exploit their tactics and strategy far quicker than states and other multilateral organizations can counter them. The final issue I would like to discuss is the battle between hard and soft counterterrorism approaches in Iraq. This is a very broad generalization, but hard counterterrorism is an enemy-centric doctrine consisting of primary offensive, hard power tactics using military operations, increased policing, and intelligence. By contrast, soft counterterrorism is often around the focal point of prevention and is more population-centric. It includes features such as capacity building, economic development, and counter-radicalization that focuses on the underlying causes that allow terrorism to thrive. Almost all state and multilateral counterterrorism strategies include an explicit pillar or arm of this soft TC approach, such as the UK Prevent Programme, the EU Prevent Pillar, and Pillars 1 and 2 of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. In reference to Iraq specifically, it is clear that hard counterterrorism programs have been at the forefront and have been undoubtedly successful in its mission of reducing the amount of territory under ISIS control. Following the rise of ISIS and its prominence, there has also been a concurrent increase in soft counterterrorism policies in Western states. These aim to prevent foreign fighters from joining ISIS and to work on the issues that cause persons to become radicalized. And Western states have invested vast sums of money in agencies and institutions that help to combat the ISIS narrative. However, this soft counterterrorism approach seems to be quite limited to Western states, with almost no reciprocal focus on soft counterterrorism measures in Iraq itself. This is a large gap in the current CT framework in Iraq. I have spent the past year interviewing former ISIS fighters and civilians who lived in ISIS-held territories in both Iraq and Syria. And although there were divergences, the general opinion of the interviewees is that almost nothing is being done to prevent the re-emergence of ISIS, with a general expectation that ISIS would re-emerge in those areas in Iraq that it previously held in the near term. The main reason behind this belief is that the underlying structural conditions which made it possible for ISIS to gain its territory are still pertinent or even more exacerbated. Many of the older persons in Iraq I spoke to seemed frustrated with the seeming cyclical nature of counterterrorism operations in Iraq. ISIS gained some territory, there was a counterterrorism operation to fight them back. ISIS retreat, a counterterrorism operation goes, ISIS come back, and then the military come in again. And there was little expectation that this cyclical nature of CT operations in Iraq would change at all in the near or long term. The soft CT challenges in Iraq that are not being met are many. These include a lack of de-radicalization and reintegration policy for armed fighters of all stripes, not necessarily violent extremists. The failure to invest in the rebuilding and restructuring of previously ISIS-held territories is vast. I was in Mosul after the fall of Mosul, and I was there 1 month ago, and I can see little difference in the development of the city. The continued injustices and grievances which many persons living in ISIS-held areas suffer from state actors, and also the lack of livelihood, education, and opportunities for civilians remain very pertinent. The narratives of ISIS remain highly attractive for civilians who lived through the period of ISIS control. And this is especially in relation to the way that many felt they're being persecuted against by the Iraqi state in the years preceding ISIS takeover, and certainly in the current climate. Developing soft counterterrorism tools and policies in Iraq is certainly not easy. However, it's vital that more efforts are made, as the attraction and capacity for ISIS to re-emerge in Iraq is exceptionally palpable. Many thanks for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Matthew Bamber. Let's continue with Dr. Stephen Tankel of the American University, Washington, D.C., with his input on foreign interests and geographical focus of counterterrorism.
Vanessa, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the hosts for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel. Very much enjoyed Matthew's presentation. I'm looking forward to Hanna's as well, and to the conversation that follows. I looked at the title of the presentation that I was asked to give, and one of the things that I really appreciated about it is that if I thought about it, it translated very much to the politics of counterterrorism. And as somebody who goes to a lot of these conferences, I think there's very often a focus on the mechanistic aspects, the tools of counterterrorism, and we tend to forget that we're talking about political violence, and so politics is particularly important. And so I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak about that today. And I'm going to talk about some of the foreign political dynamics, some of the domestic political dynamics that I think drive counterterrorism policies in the region, and then what that translates to on the ground. Starting with the foreign policy element, the first point I would make is that many of the factors that countries take into account when they determine where to focus geographically in terms of counterterrorism are the same, but the priorities that are given to them are not necessarily always similar. Threat perceptions is quite obvious and apparent. I think if one looks at policies that are produced by numerous countries, including my own, and a lot of the statements that are made publicly, there's a lot of discussion of shared threats. And ISIS was in many ways the ultimate shared threat. It was nobody's ally. It made enemies of everybody. And yet I would posit that in reality on the ground, although ISIS was a shared threat, different countries, different governments ranked that threat differently. And so we need to think not just about shared threats, but about threats relative to other threats. And I think that's apparent in the contributions that were made to the counter-ISIS coalition. I think that is apparent in terms of a lot of the political maneuvering that has taken place since ISIS lost territory. Obviously, terrorism is one threat that countries are concerned about, but it is hardly the only one that led various governments to respond here in the region. There are concerns about refugee flows. There are concerns about immigration flows. There are geographic concerns shared by countries within the region. But there are also political and economic interests. And we tend, I think, to look a lot at the policies in this region through the counterterrorism prism, and forget that there's also concerns about stabilizing areas that have economic interests or where there are important economic resources. If one looks at a lot of the countries that were contributing to the counter-ISIS coalition, it's hard to say that they were here because they were particularly concerned about terrorism. Denmark signed up to the coalition. It contributed troops in Afghanistan and to Iraq previously, in large part because the United States was doing so. And so it was in Denmark's interests as a NATO ally to be here and to be part of that. There was recent news reports that Australia is going to be sending more military personnel to the region, despite the fact that the United States claims to be focusing more and more on Asia. It's asking one of its closest allies to send troops here, and Australia is doing so because of alliance politics. And then, of course, there's also concerns about exerting influence within the region. I think we'll hear and we'll talk more later about the U.S.-Russia competition that's taking place. And I would say that we tend to lump all of this under the counterterrorism rubric, but in reality, there's a lot that takes place underneath the sort of the so-called policy umbrella of counterterrorism that has far less to do with actually combating terrorism. The second point that I would make is that domestic politics plays a role here as well. Many governments are risk averse, especially in the West. And although societal perceptions aren't necessarily going to shape the ways in which all counterterrorism policies are executed, they are going to play a disproportionate role in certain instances. I would point one to interventions. I was working at the Department of Defense in 2014 to 2015, and I was leading a strategic review for U.S. defense policy in South and Central Asia when we thought that the United States was going to draw down to 0 troops in Afghanistan. This is something that had been agreed upon, that had been vetted repeatedly. It was clear that the U.S. was getting out of Afghanistan, and then ISIS came out of Syria and took Mosul. And I remember a colleague walking out to me, clasping me on the shoulder and saying, "You can put your review to bed. There's no way the United States is coming home from Afghanistan, and we'll be back in Iraq and Syria pretty soon." He was right. Domestically, there was no way that the United States government was not going to be back here, and there was no way that the United States at that point was going to be coming home from Afghanistan. The risks politically were simply too high. I think we see similar risk aversion in a lot of European countries now in terms of taking back foreign terrorist fighters. There is absolutely zero stomach for that politically. Whether or not it's a good security policy or a bad security policy, the politics of it simply make it something that European countries are not prepared to do. Moreover, many of them are not prepared to spend money to support the prisons that are popping up in Syria and Iraq, because the idea of spending money in any way to feed terrorists or house terrorists is anathema to their populations. The flip side of that is that there are some policies that get very, very little attention. I would point to spending on different types of foreign or security assistance. There's been very, very little debate in the United States over whether or not the Trump administration should be cutting hundreds of millions of dollars for stabilization and development in the region. There's just not a lot of interest in that. It's not nearly as sexy as interventions or foreign terrorist fighters. Within the region, the issue is clearly more about quelling the threat than how it is done. It's pretty clear that if you are imprisoned in an Iraqi prison, that you are on a conveyor belt likely to a life sentence or possibly a death sentence. That is, I would argue, in some ways a function of the political situation within Iraq and the desire to move quickly to quell any perceived threat, regardless of how it's done. So I think we should be mindful of a lot of those different domestic political components. I would also note that in terms of how this plays out on the ground, and here I'll return to that concept of shared threats, that we should be wary of believing that a convergence of interests or a sense of shared threat is necessarily going to make cooperation that much more effective. It can. It certainly helps, but it's not always enough, and there are instances in which it may not even be necessary. I mentioned earlier that concept of recognizing how governments prioritize threats relative to other threats. And by the way, I shouldn't just speak about governments because, of course, the YPG and the SDF are major players in this conflict as well. And I would just offer a couple of examples. The Saudis were an early participant in the counter-ISIS coalition, and they initially started bombing runs and very quickly stopped. I think U.S. Central Command stopped charting their contributions after just a few weeks because the Saudis very quickly pivoted to the conflict in Yemen, which for them was geographically more important because of the potential Houthi threat across the border and because of Iranian influence in Yemen. And once in Yemen, and I don't want to move too far outside the Iraq and Syria realm, but I would point out that there, the Saudis and the Emiratis have made common cause at times with militias tied to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, because although those groups posed a threat to both countries, that threat was not perceived to be as large as the threat posed by Iranian-supported Houthis. So again, those politics matter. And that concept of threat relative to other threats is, I think, particularly important for instances in which efforts to build capacity work or do not work. There's plenty of research that shows if countries share common objectives for how assistance will be used, not just the long-term objectives that are being pursued, but actually how that assistance will be used on the ground, it can be quite effective. And if they do not, very often it's throwing good money after bad. At the same time, I would posit that it's possible to get some cooperation in areas where political interests diverge. If there's a long history of good intelligence cooperation, then it's possible to continue that intelligence cooperation even when politics get complicated. The U.S. and Egypt have had a very rocky relationship over the last decade or so, and yet intelligence cooperation, from what I'm told, has continued more or less unchanged because the two countries have a long history of working together. So I think we also need to recognize some of those more mechanistic areas where counterterrorism can be effective even when interests don't coincide. The final point that I would make that I was tasked with taking on was the question of whether I could identify some best practices given all of these political complications. This is always fraught because one wants to find some good news to point to, and it's difficult. I would argue that in theory, governments want to find ways to coordinate, especially where there is a shared threat. The problem is that no one wants to be coordinated. And that is true even for the closest of allies. Even something as simple as I'm going to fund training for X entity and my close ally will fund training for a separate entity can become fraught because assistance is a way of exerting influence. And so what seems like simple coordination immediately takes on political significance. Moreover, burden sharing requires division of labor, but it also requires common perceptions of both the problem and the solution. And I think that's very often lacking here in the region. We often see more success when we're talking about best practices in the military domain than in others. I think in part because militaries, although they can be political in many ways, on the ground, when it's necessary for them to work together, find ways to do so. If I were to search for a good news story, I would actually point to one right here. And I would look at the U.S. relationship with Lebanon. And I would like to close with something positive, so I'll speak to this, which is that over the last 13 to 14 years, the United States and Lebanese armed forces and internal security services, I think, have worked together quite well. There has been reasonably good news in terms of, from a U.S. perspective, I think the return on investment in terms of building a counterterrorism capability here. And I hope from the Lebanese side, a sense that that assistance has been helpful for accomplishing shared objectives here on the ground. But unfortunately, those types of shared objectives, overall and common agreement on how to obtain them, are very often in short supply for a lot of the political reasons I pointed to. And I would close with where I started, which is that this is a political issue. Military's use of force, they all have an important role to play, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I think as we're seeing now, as ISIS has lost territory, but winning the peace proves difficult, that what is needed most of all is the type of deft diplomacy that too often seems in short supply. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Stephen, for your input. Now it's Dr. Hanna Notte's turn, Hanna Notte of the Shaikh group, and she will speak about the Russian counterterrorism policies with a focus on Syria and Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you also from me for the kind invitation to attend this conference. I suppose given Russia's ongoing military operation in Idlib and associated events over recent days with the Security Council debate last Thursday, the ceasefire declaration by the Syrian government, you could say that Russian counterterrorism strategy in Syria is again in renewed focus or under renewed scrutiny by the international community. And I wanted to use my remarks to, first of all, put Russian counterterrorism strategy in Syria and Iraq in a historical context, showing how the legacy of the Chechen wars has informed Russian counterterrorism tools and narrative. Second, I will address Syria specifically and show that the overarching Russian approach to that conflict has been a counter-terrorist one from the beginning, with a binary narrative of the terrorists versus the regime, though Moscow has shown some flexibility in dealing with the armed groups over time when it has been politically expedient to do so. Third, I will move to address Iraq, where Russia has arguably been much less of a consequential counterterrorism player, notwithstanding all its efforts to the contrary. I will also draw attention to two important characteristics of Russian counterterrorism measures, which I think are interesting. The first is the interconnectedness between Russian counterterrorist measures and its economic interests in the region in recent years. And the second is an increasing confounding in the Russian counterterrorist discourse between terrorism on the one hand and any opposition activity threatening status quo regimes, whether that's in Syria or indeed at home in Russia itself. And I'll finish by addressing the question which was also posed to me about synergies and positive cooperation with the US and the EU in Syria and Iraq. So let's start with the legacy of the Second Chechen War in particular. You will all remember that from the late 1990s, Russia was embroiled in its second war in Chechnya, which, unlike the first in the mid-1990s, was framed exclusively as a counter-terrorist operation. Around that time, you had the deadly apartment bombings in Moscow in September 1999, which really propelled counter-terrorism to the top of Putin's security agenda. And it's worth recalling that around that time, in the early 2000s, Moscow was probably the most terror-affected capital in Europe. And Putin argued at the time, and I'll read one, I think, quite important quote to you from him. I quote, "The essence of the situation in the North Caucasus and in Chechnya is the continuation of the collapse of the Soviet Union. If we did not quickly do something to stop it, Russia as a state in its current form would cease to exist. We would be facing the Yugoslavization of Russia." So he viewed events in Chechnya as a threat to the very existence of the Russian Federation at the time. And importantly, he very much believed that it was the false promise of Western-style democracy, which was promoted in the 1990s and which encouraged less control for a strong center, that led to the chaos and civil war in the North Caucasus, created a power vacuum which could then be exploited by transnational terrorist forces, which the Kremlin argued was those forces were very much out there to weaken Russia. And I just want to stress this because I think that the extent to which these perceptions of Vladimir Putin himself in ascending to power at that time during the late 1990s would determine later Russia's outlook on counterterrorism in the MENA region cannot be overstated. And so Russia's counter-terrorist discourse in the Second Chechen War had two essential elements. And they're important because we see them later play out in Syria. The first element is the binary discourse. There's no distinction between good and bad Chechen rebels. Everyone against the state is a terrorist. And the second element is that the threat here posed to Russia at the time is not just a threat to Russia. It is a threat of civilizational proportions that Russia is facing. So moving on to Syria, I think this same discourse, the binary nature and the civilizational threat, was then adopted early on in the conflict by Russia, long before Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015. Russia argued early on that there's no such thing as moderate rebels in Syria, that the armed opposition is essentially a bunch of foreign mercenaries supported by external players who try to use the conflict in Syria to further their own goals. And of course, with the emergence of ISIL in the Syria-Iraq theater, Russia has then also argued that it's at the forefront of fighting a civilizational threat. And then, of course, this binary approach has also informed counterterrorism tools and tactics. In Chechnya, Russia at the time executed a large-scale conventional military operation with massive use of firepower. You might still remember the bombing of Grozny at the time. And similar in Syria, the counter-terrorist discourse was used to justify a massive air campaign from September 2015, especially towards the fall of Aleppo in late 2016, and then later in the cleanup of the so-called de-escalation zones from early 2018. So Ruta, northern Homs, Daraa, and then we see it ongoing in Idlib. And I think the counter-terrorist narrative, of course, was also important to ensure domestic public approval for the intervention in Syria when it started. So if you look at numbers in October, November 2015, 55% of Russians were in favor of airstrikes in Syria, only 27% were against. Now I want to come to one nuance here though, which I think is quite interesting. Within that, Russia has shown some flexibility in this counter-terrorist binary narrative and greater pragmatism when it has been politically expedient to do so. And a good example is to look at Russia's attitude towards Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam in Syria. So throughout, Russia has engaged in efforts to get the UN Security Council to list these groups as terrorist groups. But actually, in early 2016, Russian diplomats were saying that members of these groups could participate in the Geneva talks in an individual capacity. After the fall of Aleppo, Russia was ready to include these groups in the ceasefire of the de-escalation zones and invite them into the Astana format. And actually, if you look at the de-escalation agreements themselves and then subsequently the so-called local reconciliation agreements that were negotiated very much with a strong Russian role in 2018, Russian military folks on the ground in Syria have engaged with these armed groups as interlocutors in a very pragmatic way. And actually, anecdotal evidence suggests that Russians on the ground have seen these rebels as more pragmatic interlocutors than the Syrian government itself. But of course then, when it again became expedient and the trajectory of the war required it, Russia would then return to a more hardline stance on these groups and would use the terrorist label again to justify further offensive. So I want to read two quotes to you from early 2018, when the de-escalation zone in Ruta comes to an end and there's an operation to clean it up. Russia's ambassador to Syria was at the time saying, I quote, "I won't comment on the number of Nusra fighters in Ruta. I will only say that even in small numbers, they are a serious force and represent a significant danger. This is also because the Nusra commanders, as a rule, are unquestionably obeyed by the majority of nearby illegal armed formations, including the so-called moderate runs." And Lavrov himself was also saying at the time that in Ghouta, Akhraq al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam cooperate with the terrorist group. This fact makes these Nusra partners unprotected by the ceasefire. They are also subject to legitimate actions by the Syrian armed forces. So there you had a return to the terrorist narrative, and you had a justification for further military operation. What's the outlook going forward? Of course, we're very much talking about Idlib now. Once the military phase of the counter-terrorist operation in Chechnya was concluded, Russia somewhat recalibrated its counter-terrorist policy and coerced the republic into pacification essentially by two means. The first mean was a heavy hand. It installed Ramzan Kadyrov to reconstruct Chechnya, and he built an army of former rebels who have essentially since then oppressed any opposition to his rule in a very brutal way. And the second means was throwing money at the problem. Chechnya receives to this day very generous funding from the Russian federal budget. Now, I guess it would be interesting to discuss maybe later to what extent Russia would be in a position to replicate this kind of strategy, installing a strong man and giving resources in Idlib today. But of course, there the situation is much more complicated because Idlib is not part of the Russian Federation. You have Turkey that has a word to say about what's going on there, and Russia has very limited resources. Let's move to Iraq. When Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015, it was very keen from the start to embed this counter-terrorist campaign within a broader coalition effort. And to have some sort of division of labor or even coordination with Operation Inherent Resolve. And to that end, Russia at the time established the Quadrilateral Information Center in Baghdad, which was staffed by Russian, Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranian military personnel. And the proclaimed task at the time was to facilitate counter-terrorist intelligence exchange. And if you look at the Russian rhetoric at that time and into 2016, the Russian government publicly signaled interest in expanding the activities of this Baghdad center and even have a sort of grand coalition with the Americans. So the Russian discourse at the time often invokes the analogy even to World War II, when the Soviet Union and the United States together defeated the civilizational threat of Nazi Germany. Why not have a similar kind of spirit today in jointly defeating the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq? But actually, of course, the center never amounted to much. And Iraq, from what I understand, received very limited usable intelligence from the center, including due to US pressure. And so this Russian effort at the time never came to much. Now, Iraq, though, is a good example to illustrate how Russian counter-terrorist efforts have been used to further economic interests in the region, I think. Because in parallel to trying to become a counter-terrorist player in the Iraqi theater, Russia has substantially increased its arms sales to Iraq, actually starting from 2012, when a $4 billion US dollar deal was signed, when Nouri al-Maliki went to Moscow. Russia sells mostly air defense systems, attack helicopters, tanks to MENA governments, and not just Iraq, but also Egypt and Algeria are important clients, and these are all countries with which Russia has also increased counter-terrorist cooperation in recent years, interestingly. And let's not forget that last year, Russia exported 50% of its weapons, 50% of its arms exports went to the MENA region. And I would argue that Russia's arms sales and counter-terrorist efforts have been mutually reinforcing, because both to Russia are instruments to support highly centralized systems with strong security apparatuses that sustain incumbent regimes in the region. And so in that sense, you could say that Russia is engaged in both making money by selling weapons and what is called in Russian export безопасности, the export of security, by which we of course mean top-down regime security. Coming to the domestic dimension, I think what we can also observe, especially since 2012, is an intensifying conflation in the Russian counter-terrorist discourse more generally between terrorism on the one hand and really any opposition activity threatening a sitting government. Because what you've had in Russia since 2012, and I think it's really important because this is all happening in parallel whilst the Syrian war is unfolding, you've had a perceived growing threat to regime security inside Russia itself, with the Bolotnaya Square protests when Putin returned to the presidency in early 2012, and he very much saw public protests as directly instigated by the United States at the time. And this resulted in the passing of new legislation in Russia against so-called radical extremism, which was now treated on par with terrorism. And so, for instance, Russia's national security strategy of December 2015 describes any terrorist activity as the second in a list of threats to the state and public security. Now, the first threat is intelligence and other activities of special services of foreign states, by which, of course, the West is meant. And so Russian discourse has also argued that the emergence in recent years of ISIL, of groups like ISIL, has resulted from the double standard policy of Western states in the region. And so these new documents clearly link the terrorist threat to Russia and the dangers posed by a hostile West. So there's been a deliberate conflation between terrorist threat on the one hand and any challenges posed by non-systemic Western-backed opposition, both in Syria and in Russia itself. I want to say just quickly a few more words on the domestic side of counterterrorism in Syria and Iraq. I think, of course, it has remained important to Russia in the domestic discourse towards the Russian audience to keep stressing that many of the terrorists that Russia is fighting in Syria, including to this day in Idlib, are foreign fighters originating in the Russian Federation or in Central Asia, and so it's better to fight them there rather than here at home. So President Putin doesn't actually comment nowadays on the Syria operation all that much, sort of in Russian TV or to a domestic audience, but whenever he does, that is the element that he stresses, fighting the terrorists while they're far away. And that narrative, I guess, is also sustained by a media presentation of counter-terrorist efforts that has become highly professionalized over the years. So I think if you look at the Russian defense ministry's sort of presentation of counter-terrorist efforts 5 years ago versus today, you see that they have come a long way in the way that they present what they're doing abroad to a domestic audience. To give you one specific example, which is actually quite remarkable, if not funny, is that there's this train called Syriski Pieralom, which means Syrian breakthrough, which is currently rolling through Russia. It has a lot of platforms that display on this train Russian weapons used in Syria, weapons allegedly captured from ISIL and other such material. And it started in Moscow in February, I think, and it's rolling through the country, through 61 cities, at some point arriving in Vladivostok, showing to the Russian population what Russia has achieved in terms of counterterrorism abroad. So that shows you how the authorities are also trying to turn counterterrorism abroad into a source of domestic pride for the population. And so that also means that alternative narratives about what is going on in the region, for instance, what's going on in Idlib right now, you don't hear very much about it in the Russian discourse. So human rights organizations organizing events is something quite rare. But in my own view is that one also shouldn't over-exaggerate the importance of the counter-terrorist discourse to sustain public support for Russia's presence in Syria, because at the end of the day, I think it is something that remains quite far away to the average Russian citizen. So there is simply just not that much interest in the Russian intervention in Syria. And of course, it's also worth noting in this context that the domestic terrorist threat in Russia has receded quite significantly in recent years, since the Sochi Olympics in 2014. So statistics on terrorist attacks inside Russia continue to improve, and have remained low even as ISIL was proclaiming a vilayat in the North Caucasus in 2015. So yes, you had the St. Petersburg metro bombings in 2017. You've had the downing of the passenger plane coming from Egypt over the Sinai in October 2015, but these have been more isolated events, arguably, compared to the 2000s. I guess one issue, if we talk about the domestic side, that does continue to preoccupy Russian officials is how to deal with the return, especially of women and children from Syria and Iraq. But maybe I'll leave this for the moment and come back to the Q&A if we... I'll just finish on one last question that was posed to me, which was possibilities for cooperation and synergies with the US and EU. Of course, there has been this precedent after 9/11 when President Putin jumped on the bandwagon of the global war on terror and even supported the campaign in Afghanistan. And at that time, you had a US-Russia working group on counterterrorism, led by Richard Armitage and General Trubnikov on the Russian side. But that cooperation quickly foundered from 2003 when Russia was opposed to the Iraq war. Now today, as I hope I have tried to show, there has been very little possibility for cooperation between Russia and the United States in the Syria-Iraq theater beyond deconfliction or maybe beyond isolated events like the sort of joint patrolling of Manbij, I suppose, in the context of Operation Euphrates Shield in early 2017. And that, of course, has also been the case given the broader interest divergence between these sides on the Syrian war more broadly and the belief very much in the United States and the EU that the way that Russia conducts counterterrorism in this theater is very much breeding further resentment and thus possibly further radicalization. And so there's been a very much a disagreement even on the diagnosis of the problem in the region. And as I already said, Russian hopes for this Baghdad Information Center to become a sort of incubator for broader cooperation has also not materialized. And now what you're seeing instead, and I'll end on this, is Russia actually expanding its counter-terrorist cooperation with other like-minded states in the region. So just last week, Russia concluded counter-terrorist drills with Egypt and Belarus. There's a large anti-terrorist exercise announced with China and India this month. And so it's very much similar to Russia's political strategy in the region, where Russia has decided to work with states that it can work with, like the Astana Troika on Syria, Turkey and Iran. You see the same strategy materializing on the counter-terrorist front. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for sharing this very interesting insights with us. As announced earlier, Dr. Tankel will now shed some light on the American perspective.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks briefer just because I spoke earlier and just hit a couple of high points. I won't be as detailed as Dr. Notte, but hopefully we can get into some more of this during the question and answer. Let me start with the question of what the principles of the U.S. CT strategy are. And here I think there is one thing that the United States shares in common with Russia, which is still this concept of let's fight them over there so that we don't have to fight them over here. As a matter of fact, I would argue that in many ways, especially today, at a time when if one looks at U.S. national security strategy, U.S. national defense strategy, both of which place great power competition and competition with near-peer competitors as greater threats and priorities for the United States than counterterrorism, that protecting the homeland really remains the overarching goal for the United States. And in many ways, I would argue the United States is looking to do the bare minimum in order to accomplish those CT objectives, but there's disagreement on what that bare minimum is within the United States government. In addition to thwarting external operations that target the U.S. homeland, there's ongoing effort to pressure and contain terrorist networks, including ISIS in the region, and to work through partner nations. Since really the second term of the Bush administration, and really during the Obama administration, and one area that the Trump administration has continued, is this focus on working by, with, and through partner nations burden share wherever possible. As I noted earlier, for a lot of political reasons, that sometimes works better in theory than in practice. But beyond pressuring the network here and building the capacity of partner nations to take on the fight, there's not, I don't think, a whole lot more going on than we see in the military space. From Trump's perspective, the United States has defeated ISIS. That is not a perspective that is shared by most of his administration. And that has made for a somewhat disjointed approach to the region. And I think we've seen that in the way in which efforts to stabilize Iraq and continue to contribute to SDF and others in Syria has been an area of contention within the U.S. government. What does the United States do in terms of terrorism in the region? I would point to a number of things that still remain critical. One is in its efforts to thwart external operations and to pressure the network, there's a continued focus on high-value targeting, which is not going to defeat groups, but is, I think, intended to keep the threat at bay. I've heard people refer to this as quote-unquote mowing the lawn. The problem with that that I think is recognized within U.S. counterterrorism circles is that the United States continues to mow the lawn and the grass continues to grow faster and faster. There's tools to track foreign fighters. There's a lot of efforts to build capacity of special forces, especially in Iraq. The one area that I would point to I think is absolutely critical in terms of the U.S. Contribution here is in what is termed military enablers. By that, I mean intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, often through unmanned aerial vehicles, airlift, medevac, airstrikes, all of these discrete capabilities that the United States is able to bring to bear, I think are a real force multiplier on the ground. They are hardly sufficient to accomplish what seem to be, at least on paper, much larger objectives for the United States and other countries in the region. But I would also submit that if the United States military and those enablers were to disappear, that it would be much harder to keep that pressure on ISIS that we've seen up until this point. Turning to the question of U.S., EU, and then on the one hand and Russia on the other, I would say that U.S. counterterrorism efforts in the region both complement and compete with its goals with regard to Russia and Iran. On the one hand, the CT mission is a reason to remain in the region, and it's pretty clear if the United States were to withdraw entirely that Russia could continue to fill that vacuum. That is not a popular reason within the United States for keeping U.S. forces in the region, and so the CT mission is sort of trotted out as the reason to be here. I think we've increasingly seen that with U.S. Efforts to pressure Iran as well. And here I think we begin to see ways in which the CT mission competes with those other priorities. And I would point to especially the Iran case, where I think the Trump administration has been perhaps a little too transparent for its own good in terms of talking about its desire to use Iraq as a platform from which to pressure Iran, and that threatens to build an aversion to the U.S. presence in Iraq from a domestic political perspective. That could lead to U.S. forces no longer being as welcome there as they are now. And then the final point that I would make is that I would agree with Dr. Notte that in terms of U.S.-Russia in particular, really deconfliction is the most we can ask for. In terms of the U.S. and European Union, I think we could ask for more. I think both sides could, but I don't think that we're necessarily seeing it. The U.S. has reduced its financial contributions, and the EU has done so as well. I think the United States' vacillation about whether or not to keep forces in the region has contributed to European uncertainty and made it harder potentially for the Europeans to keep forces here in the region over the long term. And again, I would return to that point that U.S. enablers, I think in particular, are seen as critical, not just for Iraqi forces or for the SDF, but also for Europeans who are here. And uncertainty about how long the U.S. will continue to be able to provide those types of capabilities leads Europeans to begin thinking about making other plans. I would close with this, which is that there is widespread agreement among most of what is termed the interagency, which is the State Department, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the other elements of the United States government focused on security, that there should be some U.S. presence within the region for the foreseeable future. But there is disagreement on what that presence should look like and on what it should do. The U.S. counterterrorism strategy speaks about a whole of government approach. But the reality is that the only real commitment that we have seen kept so far, and that I think we can count on in any way for the foreseeable future until perhaps, there's withdrawal by tweet, is a U.S. military presence. That type of whole of government approach has not really manifested in terms of a commitment to stabilization or to development. And the final point that I would make here, because we are at a conference organized by civil society, is the U.S. counterterrorism strategy speaks about a commitment to civil society, but in reality, and you were talking about that concept of radical extremism, struck me that I would point to governments across the region that have used the concept of terrorism quite broadly and applied it to a range of civil society actors as a way to repress them. And one of the areas where I think the United States, quite frankly, has been most problematic is in that although neither the Bush or the Obama administrations got political reform right, and I think both failed more than they succeeded, they at the very least made political reform an aspect of counterterrorism that they were going to focus on in one way or another. And the Trump administration has pretty much abandoned that. And I think that we are seeing the results of that across the region in terms of the way civil society and populations at large are cracked down upon. And that does not bode well in general, and in particular when one thinks about the types of risk factors for terrorism that are pretty well identified in terms of repressive policies. Thank you.
So thank you once again, Stephen, and also thank you very much to Hanna and Matthew. I think they have provided us with a lot of food for thought, and we are now ready to open the discussion for about another 30 to 45 minutes. And yeah, just before you ask your questions or comments, just please just briefly introduce yourselves. Thank you.
But I want especially to ask Hanna concerning something we didn't hear about. Concerning especially the Astana conference, Astana meeting, and the cooperation between the Russia and Turkey, the military cooperation concerning the part of Syria. So, regardless your presentation concerning the domestic issues in Russia and talking about the Chechen issue, but I think that we would like to hear about the impact of the Astana meeting and concerning the military cooperation between Russia and Turkey in Syria. Mainly the impact of those two phenomena concerning their impact on the terrorist issue in Syria, because it should have, or I don't know what your assessment, if there is an impact, deep impact on the terrorist issue after such kind of cooperation. What is there a kind of understanding with the United States on those two issues of Astana and the military cooperation between Russia and Turkey on the Syrian soil? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Your Excellency, for the question. I mean, to my mind, the Astana format has been a tool for Russia from early 2017, which is, I mean, the inception of the Astana format of the process is after the fall of Aleppo in late 2016, at which point, of course, Russia had already successfully co-opted Turkey into its broader strategy on Syria, which I think was one of the most remarkable and consequential developments in the Syrian war, because you will remember that in November 2015, there was a deep crisis in Russian-Turkish relations over Syria, with the downing of the jet, the imposition of sanctions. But then Putin understood quite well that to Turkey, the main threat in Syria came from the Kurds, from the YPG in the northeast of the country, and not necessarily anymore from Bashar al-Assad staying in power. So the Russians at the time gave a sort of yellow-greenish light to Operation Euphrates Shield. You have the operation in Aleppo in late 2016, and then you get to the Astana format. So from the Russians, when Operation Euphrates Shield starts, the Russians don't go all out criticizing the Turkish operation. They sort of stay quiet on that. When Operation Euphrates Shield, the first Turkish operation in Syria, starts, I believe in September, October 2016. And so I think that was, from the Russian side, quite a smart move vis-à-vis Turkey. Once you get to the Astana format in early 2017, the Astana process, the way I look at it with hindsight, becomes the mechanism whereby which you can initially have de-escalation in certain parts of the country, the 4 zones we all know, Eastern Ghouta, Northern Homs, Daraa and Idlib, which de facto enabled the Syrian regime to turn east towards the Euphrates, to gain more territory there while you had the relative calm in these zones. But later on you turned backwards in early 2018 to essentially conduct further military operations in these zones, which all, as we know, went according to a certain scheme, that there was negotiation facilitated by the Russians with the armed groups on the ground, saying you can either reconcile your status with the Syrian government or you're free to leave to Idlib. And now we have 1 zone left. So that cooperation materialized. So what was the effect or the impact of that on terrorism in Syria? I guess it comes back to your definition of the terrorists in Syria. To Russia, that was a way of further undermining the armed opposition against the Syrian government. And now you're in a situation where where you only have Idlib left. How consequential was the Astana format on the fight against ISIL in Syria? Not all that consequential. What was the coordination with the Americans from the Astana format? I mean, the Americans. From now, if I recall correctly, when the format started, and we have now had 13 rounds of Astana talks on the Syrian conflict. Now, a few points are important here, I think. First of all, the Americans were from the beginning invited to attend in an observer capacity. If I recall correctly, they attended one of the early rounds and then stopped sending observers. This format has now morphed into something that Russia has used to actually enhance its cooperation with other regional states, you are well aware that Lebanon and also Iraq and Jordan are now observers in the Astana format. So Russia essentially saying, we've tried with the West, we've tried with the Americans, it's not working, we will increase our cooperation from the Astana format, broaden out with those states who want to work with us. And of course, something else has happened with the Astana format. It was initially intended to deal with military and counter-terrorist questions exclusively, also with detainees, with such questions on the Syrian ground. But arguably over time, this format has also morphed into something that has taken up the question of a political process in Syria. As Geneva was not moving anywhere and was deadlocked, it's now in the Astana format that we're talking about the launch of a constitutional committee for Syria after the Sochi Congress in Russia in early 2018. So it has now also, even though the Russians keep saying that ultimately we have a UN-led political process and that it's the prerogative of Special Envoy Pedersen to announce a constitutional committee in Geneva, these questions are now being discussed in Astana. But the Astana format, in the way I understand it, has not done anything to increase coordination or let alone cooperation between the Astana Troika states and the United States or Western countries. You know that there's this so-called small group of states on the Syria file, including the United States, Germany, France, Britain, I believe Saudi and Jordan and Egypt. And especially President Macron had over time tried to build some bridges and achieve some convergence between these small group states and the Astana format. But quite frankly, the results of that have been rather, have not been that material.
Good morning. I am retired Brigadier General Hamid Skandar. My question is addressed to Mrs. Hanna as well. As we all know that the military tool alone cannot defeat terrorism and extremism. But we need in parallel to use the soft tools like intelligence, law enforcement, cultural, social, economical, and others. Since Russia is deeply involved in the war in Syria, is playing a major role in the military and in the war. But we don't know that much about the Russian counter-terrorism strategy in Syria regarding the use of soft tools, how to tackle the root causes of terrorism, and how to help in order to restore the stability and the peace in Syria. Can you answer this question, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think when it comes to that question that you posed, is where you see the divergence in the Russian versus US-EU approach to the conflict sort of in its most acute form. Because the Russian strategy right now to deal with the soft element of preventing further radicalization or doing counterterrorism successfully in a sustainable way, the approach is the economy comes first. That is why Russia is now pushing the reconstruction and refugee return and rehabilitation of the Syrian government approach, I mean, since the summer of last year, if not even before, so hard. They're basically saying, once things get better economically in Syria, other things will get better too. I mean, I've had a Russian diplomat once say to me, sort of criticizing this Western principled stance that there can be no reconstruction support without what the West keeps referring to as a credible political process. He criticized that as saying, you cannot wait to have a beautiful garden at home in Syria and then the people will come back. You have to come back now and help rebuild your country, and then things will get better over time, and then political conditions will improve, and sort of that in the Russian thinking then I guess undermines further reasons for radicalization, extremism, and ultimately terrorism. So it's a reconstruction and a refugee return approach first, and of course the Western stance on this question is sort of diametrically opposed. Now beyond that, what are they doing sort of on the ground in Syria in terms of soft sort of counter-terrorist measures? Not very much, I think, to be completely honest with you. I mean, one thing that that speaks maybe a little bit to this is I think that the deployment of Russian military police has been done in quite a smart way, that you have recruited essentially exclusively from the North Caucasus Sunni Muslims to be deployed to these areas to man the checkpoints and to enforce sort of order and security in these de-escalation zones once the military operations were over, to, I guess, enhance sort of common understanding with the local population, not alienate them. But that is not really directly speaking to your point about counter-terrorism or sort of working with local populations. So it's really the economic reconstruction narrative that comes first from the Russian mind, and that is again, I guess, a parallel to how they look at what made Chechnya, in their view, successful, you know, because it is relatively pacified today, even if it's sort of held, you know, in that position through a, you know, very oppressive regime. But it was as I said earlier, partially by throwing money at the problem.
Thank you very much. My name is Rend Al-Rahim from the Iraq Foundation. Mr. Tankel, I am curious that you say that the Obama administration held the banner of political reform in Iraq. Was I correct in understanding that?
No, what I said was that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration at least made efforts at promoting political reform, even if those efforts were, by and large, unsuccessful in many respects, whereas the Trump administration, I think arguably, at the very least, the president himself has very, very little interest in promoting good governance and rule of law abroad or, quite frankly, at home.
Yeah. No comment on that last statement. In my view, and you know, I follow Iraq very carefully, the notion of political reform was abandoned in Iraq, was abandoned by Obama at least during his second term, if not earlier. And there was very little pressure on the then Iraqi government to reform either the judiciary or to reform political party formation or corruption or any of that. And they expressed no interest whatsoever. And even in counterterrorism, if I remember correctly, ISIS occupied Mosul in June 2014. There was no US reaction until perhaps January 2015, when ISIS began to threaten the Kurdish region, threatened Erbil. Up to that point, the Obama administration had not even moved against ISIS in Iraq. And I would argue that this total neglect during the second Obama administration of political reform, of interest in creating a more equitable distribution of power, gave direct rise to the control of ISIS of huge parts of Iraq. This is my humble opinion. I don't know what you think about it. I have a question as well, and that concerns the thousands, perhaps as many as 30,000 ISIS captives who were moved from Syria to Iraq. In terms of counter-terrorism thinking and policies, how does that fit in? I mean, how does the US expect to deal with those, because there clearly are a terrorist threat, and they're housed in camps and so on, and there simply doesn't seem to be any solution to that or any thinking about a solution, whether it relates to the foreign fighters who were moved to Iraq or the Iraqi fighters who are in Iraq. There's no assistance to the Iraqi judiciary to deal with the problem. There's no mechanism and there's no infrastructure, either international or joint Iraqi international or Iraqi alone to deal with the situation. And I know that the Iraqi government has actually raised the issue of creating a joint legal mechanism to deal with it jointly with the international community. But as far as I know, they have not received a response. What is the counterterrorism approach to this problem?
So let me respond to your comment first. You're not going to get an argument from me that the Obama administration was slow in its response to ISIS. I don't think that there's much debate on that, or that it only responded, as you noted, when the threat migrated. I would note, I think the context on reform is important, and again, I would stress that my point was that the Bush and Obama administrations had at least sort of paid lip service to and rhetorically promoted the importance of that, even if we didn't see it manifest on the ground. When Obama came into office, I think there was a very, very conscious effort to pull back on the promotion of democracy in particular, because of the way in which that had been perceived and received within the region, and the way in which it had become intrinsically tied to the Bush administration's casus belli in some ways for the Iraq war to begin with. But there was an effort, not necessarily successful, to promote good governance and rule of law at a more technocratic level. Again, not necessarily successful, but in terms of if one looks at where the United States spent its dollars, there was more spent on those types of programs. Again, technocratic approach, not necessarily the type of political pressure that you're talking about. So that's not a defense. That's more of just this is sort of, I think, the way in which the administration approached that. And again, I think you're correct in that there was not nearly the effort that there could have been to be more involved in the political dynamics in Iraq after the U.S. withdrawal, although after the U.S. withdrawal, I think there was also less U.S. leverage as well. Turning to your question about what to do about the people in the camps, I have no good answer for you, and I don't think the United States does either. I would make a couple points. One is when you talk about what to do with those foreign fighters, the United States, after some hemming and hawing, has said it will take back the foreign fighters from the United States, and it has tried to prevail upon other countries to do the same. The United States has very limited leverage on other countries to get them to take back their foreign fighters. This is a non-starter in most European capitals. They simply do not want those people coming back. Tunisia has accepted a small number of the hundreds who have gone. Lebanon, I think, has accepted a small number. Most countries are, it's very early in the process to take those individuals back. Some of the things I think the United States has tried to do to make that easier is to make advancements in terms of how it shares battlefield evidence that was collected to enable prosecution, to try to facilitate best practice sharing of best practices in terms of rehabilitation, reintegration. Has also tried to raise money for the types of improvements on the ground in terms of prison reforms. I mean, I don't have to tell you that prisons are not particularly in good shape. But this is, quite frankly, I understand that the United States is still seen as, the biggest player. This is not, I think, a problem that the United States on its own can solve. I mean, can it be more involved? Can it be less equivocal in terms of its commitment to the region? Absolutely. But the United States cannot and will not, and frankly, in my opinion, should not be solely responsible or shouldering the majority of the cost for, for housing and feeding and securing all of those prisoners, or for, trying to facilitate their, legal disposition or return home. I think it could be playing a more constructive role internationally in some of those legal areas. But again, the real crux of the matter, I would argue, especially when it comes to women, children, and foreign fighters, those are the hardest issues at play, right? I mean, Iraqis that are held in Syria, Syria is held in Iraq. That's an easier issue to manage. The international fighters and their families, in many respects, that's going to be up to the countries from whence they came.
Sorry, I'd just like to make a couple of points as well. What Stephen said definitely about the European intransigence regarding taking back their citizens is very true. In the UK, we have adopted a policy of often making foreign fighters stateless at the moment, contravening international law. You're right about the threat of counterterrorism that these camps pose. I was in these camps a few months ago, and the conditions are probably the worst I've ever seen. There's a mixing of ISIS fighters and non-ISIS fighters. People were saying that they could easily buy their way out. The going rate was $1,000 to get your way out of the camp. And ISIS has a history as well of breaking into prisons and getting its members out. And I think this is something that we will start to see more and more in the coming months and years, because it's exceptionally easy to do. These camps are massively underfunded. I think it's quite a short-term approach that many Europeans and perhaps the US as well are taking with regards to not trying as best as possible to fund these camps and to sort out the situation there.
Hi, my name is Mana Alami. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. My first question is to Matthew and Stephen. I'd like a perspective on the normalization of the use of violent non-state armed actors as a counter-terrorism tool, and especially in total disregard of the ethnic and sectarian problematics it might raise. My second question is to Hanna. I really appreciated your intervention. Hanna, so far, and you've really rightly pointed, Russia has had a very coherent, I think, foreign policy and counterterrorism approach to the Syrian issue, contrary to, for example, to the West and the US that is often accused of being transactional. Do you expect a shift in this the level of transactionality towards its partners in Syria, especially Iran and, for example, non-state armed actors such as Hezbollah? We've seen recently in the last year there's more unease within the Hezbollah community in regard of Russia's action. There's also, we've seen that Israel has been able to strike Iranian and Hezbollah interest in Syria, and I think it's very interesting to see in the recent statement by Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah that it would strike from Lebanon and not from Syria. That raises the question, of obvious red lines enforced by Russia on Iran and Hezbollah in Syria. So do you expect a shift in Russian policy? Thank you.
Many thanks for your question. I think the dynamics of sectarianism play out a lot more in Iraq than in Syria generally. The violence has become exceptionally normalized. And I think what's violent non-state, yeah.
Exactly, the use of them as counter.
Yes, yeah, the PMF, yeah. I think this is a problem that's coming up more and more in Iraq, and especially with the PMF. When speaking to persons who are living in PMF-controlled areas, they're almost drawing no distinction between the actions of ISIS and those of the PMF, and also those of the SDF. For lots of them, we might make a moral equivalence here, but for lots of them, they were suffering the same levels of violence and same levels of persecution. So it's interesting to hear from those people living there. They often don't draw much distinction. And so when one country or one state comes in and supports one side against the other, this naturally prejudices them against that country. So I think it's definitely a huge issue, and from hearing people on the ground, there's really not much distinction.
Sure. First, I think the United States is hardly the first actor to support or work with violent non-state actors in the region. That doesn't mean that I don't hear your concerns about the fact that the United States is increasingly doing that as well. And to a degree, This is the function of the, what is very clearly emerged as the U.S. approach to counterterrorism more broadly, which is to work by, with, and through whichever partners on the ground are going to be the most effective and efficient. And in the case of Iraq and Syria, that has been, that has turned out to be, a non-state force. I don't know that we should expect that to change. I think if I look at where U.S. policy and practice are going, I think even some of the authorities that have been created for the Department of Defense are designed to enable them to work with partner forces, not nation-state partners, but partner forces, be they state or non-state. And so this may be the new normal, especially as the United States transitions to try to focus more and more on near-peer competitors and state-to-state competition. Not for nothing that a lot of people have been predicting the sort of the return of proxy forces as part of a larger great power competition. So that, I think, creates a conundrum for people who want to influence policy and for policymakers. On the one hand, we can try to make arguments that this is a bad idea and you shouldn't do it. And on the other hand, if the United States and other countries are going to do it anyway, then I think it's incumbent upon policymakers to find ways to put guardrails on the process. And I can tell you that if one looks at some of the debates that are taking place within U.S. policy circles in policy circles in the United States, it entails how to apply current laws related to human rights protections that relate to how the United States works with partner nations to working with non-state partner forces, that ask questions about when the United States should be prepared to use force in support of non-state partners in the same ways that it might use force in support of partner forces. These are normative questions, but they are also legal questions that the United States will have to work through if it's going to continue down this road. And so I think we are in some ways in a middle ground here where, yes, it has become more normalized, but it has not become so normalized that we have those types of guardrails. And I would reiterate, I take your point about the dangers that this poses. But if this is going to be the new normal, then I think, sort of the realistic, if not optimal outcome, is to find ways in which to put guardrails on the process. And also to be more mindful of the political outcomes that result from this. And I think this is an area where the United States was sort of, to use a colloquialism, kicking the can down the road as much as it could in terms of the political consequences of working with the Kurds, and kicked that can down the road as much as it could. And now that, it's sort of, to mix colloquial metaphors, the bill is coming due. And the United States is sort of struggling with how to reconcile its commitment to a very, very effective non-state force, with whom the United States military has actually worked quite well and quite closely on the ground, with its need to maintain relations with, an erstwhile ally like Turkey, for example, with whom it's not worked nearly as well, but with whom it has a state-to-state alliance. And these are, I think, the types of questions that, if this is going to become normalized, the United States in particular and other countries are going to have to become more adept at dealing with. So I'd like to tell you, here's how we're not going to do it, but I'd be lying to you.
Just a quick note before Hanna will answer the question. We have about another 15 minutes. I saw one more question over there. Any other questions that come up? I would like to collect and then ask for quick answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona, for your question about the Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah, Israel sort of equation. Has Russian policy changed, or can we expect a change? well, what has Russian policy on that file been so far? I think Russia has tried to walk a fine balancing act between these different actors, trying to prevent escalation. It's been always important for Putin to show consideration to Israeli security concerns in the Syrian theater. And so what Russia has done is engaged with all actors at all times. I don't believe that any two leaders have met more frequently than Putin and Netanyahu in recent years. You've had Russia often turning a blind eye to Israeli strikes on either Iranian or Hezbollah targets in Syria, except for, there were a few exceptions when the Russian military did sort of take a public stance and criticized what the Israelis were doing. Of course, then last summer, after the military operation in Daraa, you had the Russians saying, well, now the Iranians have distanced themselves 85 or 100 kilometers from the Golan Heights. Isn't this a great achievement? Then afterwards, it became clear that things were not that clear, even though Russians to this day say that this is something that was successfully achieved. Then you had, as recently as I think June, Bolton and Patrushev meeting in Jerusalem to talk about this whole file again. To my knowledge, there's no further kind of breakthrough on that whole question. As I said, the Russians have you know, you could almost summarize their approach to saying that you hope that none of these actors want an escalation into war, and so inshallah it just won't happen. So I think there's a Russian calculation, really, if you speak to diplomats, an argument that neither side wants a war, and so it won't happen. And there's not much more that Russia can do other than to try to call for restraint on all sides. I mean, I actually asked myself the question even in recent weeks, well, what would the Russians actually do if things escalated further, let's say now, between Hezbollah and Israel, or further in the southwest of Syria? My answer would actually be very little, other than, you know, working through various diplomatic channels, which is what the Russians have even now done, I think, in recent days and weeks. Beyond that, there's, to my mind, not that much that they can do. But this is, of course, also part of the larger geopolitical equation now, you know, Iran in the region and the US maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And to my mind, since the Iranians are still an important partner to the Russians on the Syria file, if you're sitting in Moscow right now, you don't want to be putting more pressure on the Iranians. And so, you know, you keep talking to all sides and hope that that will be good enough. So my answer would be, I don't see a change in that overall Russian approach to the problem set.
Bassem Shab, former member of parliament. I enjoyed the presentations and the discussion. I have a question to Stephen. We've seen a regression of the U.S. position in the Middle East. There's less interest in energy. ISIS is defeated. Clearly, there's no interest in nation building and increased tolerance for failed states. There's no freedom agenda. And the question is, what is the agenda? And my question is, we're expecting now presidential elections. Do you see a change in this? Yes. Do you see a change in this tendency in U.S. policy? Even if a Democrat is elected president, do you think he can reverse these changes under the Trump administration? And the other question is the deepening rift with Turkey. How do you see that affecting the situation? We've seen the U.S. now forging a strategic alliance with Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, sort of abandoning the Levant. And I'd like you to comment on that, if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. So, and I'm in the position of trying to interpret what, you know, an agenda for the region when I'm not quite sure that that there's agreement within the administration on what the agenda is for the region. I think several things stand out. One is the counter-Iran effort is very clearly paramount in many ways. I don't think that, let me take a step back. I don't believe that the U.S. government believes that ISIS is defeated. which is an odd thing to say because the head of the U.S. government believes that ISIS is defeated. But there's a disconnect there. And so I think there is an ongoing effort within the U.S. government to try to maintain pressure on ISIS without necessarily doing the nation building or stabilization to the degree that is necessary. So I take your point there, but I don't think that there's an agreement that ISIS is defeated. But that said, I think that it's very, very clear that there is a growing focus on Iran at the expense of other threats within the region, and that a lot of U.S. policy towards different countries in the region can be interpreted through that prism. That's not me saying that is a good agenda item. That is me saying that is what I see coming out of the Trump administration. The other element of this, which has somewhat gone hand in hand, is I think a growing focus on arms sales in the region. And that is in part driven by the president's focus on growing the U.S. defense industrial base. I think that is a misplaced focus, in part because arms sales doesn't actually create nearly as many jobs as I think the president thinks they will. But nevertheless, there is a real willingness to execute either arms sales through the U.S. government or direct commercial sales, in countries in the region that are willing to pay. And I mention those two because those are two of the things that I think stand out for me when I look at how the United States has approached the region. And I think there are two things that might change under a Democratic administration. I don't think that the aversion to nation building is going to change. I think that we're past the point where any U.S. president wants to be so heavily invested in the region in terms of nation building or troop presence. I think if you look at what a lot of the Democratic candidates have said, they talk even more than Trump does about, sort of ending the quote-unquote forever war and rebalancing our efforts away from this region. I think we might see a greater focus on the use of engagements, including security assistance, to try to promote governance, human rights, rule of law, or we might not. At the very least, I think there's rhetoric in that direction. But I think we would see less of a focus on Iran and less of a focus on arms sales with a Democrat in office. As for Turkey, this is the United States, I think, is and Turkey are very much caught in and I'm not an expert on Turkey by any stretch, so I'm coming at this very much from a U.S. perspective in terms of its broader foreign policy objectives, is that, the countries are caught in this sort of very, very bad marriage, right, where they are NATO allies, and unless anybody is going to talk about evicting Turkey from NATO, there's going to be a need to find some way forward. But lest it be lost on anybody, the United States is, ready to slap sanctions on a, what is essentially a treaty ally, which is a very uncommon situation in which to find ourselves. Turkey has, chosen to buy S-400 missiles from Russia, despite the fact that a NATO ally has threatened to slap sanctions on it for doing so. I don't know how the two countries are going to find their way out of it. I have begun to heard, and I do not want to start I don't want to suggest by any means that there is a real consideration of evicting Turkey from NATO, but I've begun to hear, sort of questions about, hey, should somebody write that article and sort of weigh the pros and the cons and sort of play this out in ways that I have not heard before, right? Somebody asking that question, which speaks to me about the very poor nature of the relationship.
All right, thank you very much. I don't see any further questions, and also we stuck to the time frame, so thank you very much for that. Thank you very much to our experts for sharing your interesting insights. Thank you for the interesting and great comments and questions. I think the coffee break is very well deserved now. Yes, we have the break until 11:45 until we proceed. Thank you.